Some people with a little experience in chess may have heard of the famous four-move checkmate. For a beginner, this can sound both exciting and scary. Who wouldn't want to win in 4 moves? And of course, nobody wants to lose in 4 moves. Luckily, the four-move checkmate is only dangerous in name. If you know what you're doing, that is. The four-move checkmate is a fast attack that develops some pieces very quickly toward the center and the enemy king. White typically opens the game with e4, controlling the center and opening lines for the light square bishop and queen. Black responds with e5, controlling the center and opening up lines. And after bishop to c4, White quickly brings the bishop to an active diagonal, controlling the center and pointing at the weak f7 square. Notice the f7 square is only protected by Black's king. Black typically plays knight to c6, making a sensible developing move, or sometimes will play bishop to c5. In either case, White has the option of the aggressive queen to h5, joining the bishop in the attack against the key f7 square. If Black isn't careful, White will deliver checkmate on the very next move. Knight f6 is a very common mistake. Black moves the knight toward the center and threatens to win the queen. What could possibly be wrong with this move? Unfortunately, it forces the white queen to move exactly where it wanted to go, the f7 square, and deliver checkmate. You'll notice that the black king has nowhere to run. Black also can't block the check as the queen is literally touching the king. Notice Black has no piece to capture the queen, and the king cannot capture the queen, because then the light square bishop would capture the king, and that's not allowed. This is the four-move checkmate. Now let's go back and see how Black could have avoided this unfortunate end to the game. After the moves e4, e5, bishop c4, knight c6, and queen h5, Black must block the f7 square. The best way to do this is by playing g6. It attacks the queen, and it prevents the queen from capturing f7. White retreats the queen, but don't celebrate too early. The white queen refocuses its attack on the f7 square, threatening checkmate on the very next turn. Black can once again block the queen's path to the f7 square and develop a piece at the same time with knight f6. Notice if white tried to capture the knight, Black would recapture and win the queen. At this point, Black is safe and white has wasted some time running around with the queen. Finally, we have one more aggressive idea to be prepared for when our opponent tries to win the game with the four-move checkmate. After e4, e5, white does not have to play bishop to c4 on the next turn. White could play the more aggressive queen h5. White threatens the weakened f7 square and threatens to win the e5 pawn with check. Remember, it's very important to defend the e5 pawn first, and only then block the queen's attack on the f7 square. The best move for Black is knight c6, developing a piece toward the center and protecting the e5 pawn. After bishop to c4, white's bishop joins the attack on the f7 square. Do you remember how Black can best block the f7 square and attack the queen? That's right, g6. White sets up another checkmate with queen f3, threatening to take on f7. Do you remember how to block the second checkmate attack? That's right, knight to f6. Now that you've learned what the four-move checkmate is, it's time to see what you've learned. In the four-move checkmate lesson, we learned a new concept where Black was checkmated by the white queen, and Black couldn't capture the queen with the king because the queen was protected by the bishop on c4, like this. A king can never put itself in check, even when capturing. So many times when you checkmate, it's done by one piece who is checking and one piece that is protecting and assisting the other piece. Let's see some examples of assisted checkmates. In this position, white can deliver checkmate by using the queen to put the king in check with the assistance of the pawn protecting the queen. Can you see the mate in one? If you found queen g7 checkmate, great job. The queen attacks the king, and the king cannot escape the check because the queen covers all of the king's escape squares and the pawn protects the queen, meaning the black king cannot capture the queen. It's checkmate. Game over. Let's look at another example. In this position, black's king does not have any legal squares. Notice that both the white knight and queen join together on the g8 square, right next to the king. White can deliver a check with the queen that is assisted by the knight on e7 with queen g8, checkmate. Now that you've learned how pieces assist each other in delivering checkmate, it's your turn to practice assisted checkmates. It's very rare to checkmate with just one piece. It usually requires several pieces to surround and finally checkmate the king. One of the most important examples of this is checkmating with two rooks, sometimes called the rook roller. Let's see how this works. In this position, notice the rook on c2 controls the entire c-file. This means that the black king cannot enter the c-file as long as the rook is on that file. Rook d1 checks the king on the d-file, and since the king can't enter the c-file, black's king is forced to move closer to the edge of the board. Now that the d-file is covered by the rook on d1, let's use the other rook to check the king on the e-file. Rook e2 check. Notice that the rooks take turns checking the king, cutting the black king off one file at a time. Let's watch the rook rollers roll the king up onto the edge of the board and deliver checkmate. After king f7, we bring the other rook to the f-file, checking the king. The king moves to the g-file. Now that the f-file is covered, we play rook to g2 check. The king is forced to the edge of the board and has run out of files. It's checkmate on the next move with rook h1, checkmate. The rook roller doesn't only work on files, it also works on ranks. Notice the rook on h4 covers the entire fourth rank. So in this case, we use the other rook to check the king on the fifth rank. And since the fourth rank and fifth rank are now covered by the rooks, the king gets rolled up the board again. King c6, rook h6 check, king to d7, rook to g7 check, and after king e8, rook h8, checkmate. Now that you've learned how to checkmate with two rooks against the king, it's your turn to practice checkmating with the rook rollers. Even the powerful queen cannot checkmate the king all by itself. Many times you will find yourself with just your king and queen against the other king, and you need to know how to finish the job. It can be pretty frustrating unless you know what you're doing. Let's see how it works. In this position, we can use an assisted checkmate idea to win the game in just one move. Notice that the white king and queen both meet on the G7 square, right next to the black king. The queen can move to that square, checking the black king, and since the white queen is protected by its own king, the game is checkmate. Delivering a checkmate in the corner of the board is nice, but how do we force the king to the corner and set up checkmate? Let's take a look. In this position, black's king is on the central square D5. In order to checkmate the king, it must be forced to the edge of the board. Notice that the black king can move to any of the other central squares on the next turn, D4, E4, or E5. White's first goal is to prevent the king from staying in the center of the board and pushing it toward the corners. Queen to E3 prevents the king from staying in the center, so the king must move toward the corners. After king D6, white's next job is to prevent the black king from returning to the center. Queen to E4. Notice the queen is keeping the king out of the center, and it's slowly pushing the black king toward the corner. You'll also see that white's queen is always one knight move distance away from the black king. We'll see the white queen continue to shadow the king a knight's distance away for the rest of the game. Black plays king C5, still trying to stay near the center, and white plays queen D3. After king C6, queen D4. Notice black moves up a square, white's queen moves up a square. The black king moves down a diagonal square, the queen moves down a diagonal square. The king moves up, the queen moves up. Notice always a knight's distance away. After king A7, the king goes up a diagonal square, the white queen goes up a diagonal square as well. Now comes the most important part of this position. After king A8, should the white queen continue to shadow the king a knight's distance away? If queen B6 is played, the black king does not have a legal square, but it is also not check. Do you remember what we call that when that happens? That's right, stalemate. It's a draw. So be sure to avoid that move. In this position, once you get the king into the corner, allow it to continue to dance on these two squares, back and forth, until your white king is able to set up an assisted checkmate. Let's see how that works. After king C2, king A7, king C3, king A8, king C4, king A7, king C5, king A8, king C6, king A7. Now that white's king is close to the queen, can you find an assisted checkmate in this position? That's right. Queen to B7, checkmate. The white king assists the queen in delivering the checkmate to the king. Now that you've learned how to checkmate with the queen versus king, it's your turn to practice checkmating the king. As you've already learned, checkmate with two rooks is pretty easy, and checkmating with just one queen is simple too, once you know how to do it. Another common checkmate comes from king plus rook versus king. In this position, you don't have the power of the queen, and instead have to use some patience to get the job done. Let's see how to do it. The first thing the rook needs to do is put the king into a box. After rook h4, notice the black king is within this box, and white's goal is to never allow the black king to escape from this box. Black's king gets closer to the rook, and white's rook unlike the queen, will need help from the king to push the black king into the corner and deliver checkmate. The reason why is the rook cannot move diagonally, so the lone king can sneak up and attack the rook from a diagonal. This means white needs to bring the king closer to the rook and protect it, like this. After king g5, black threatens to win white's rook, and white's king arrives just in time to protect the rook. White begins the slow but effective plan of pushing black's king back into a corner in order to deliver checkmate. After every move, the side with the rook has to ask, can my rook safely shrink the box? If the answer is yes, then move the rook. If the answer is no, then move the king closer to the opponent's king. In this position, can white's rook safely shrink the box? Yes, it can, with rook g4. How about now? Can white shrink the box again? If you said rook f4, you're correct. White shrinks the box once again. After king d5, can white shrink the box? Well, not safely, because after rook e4, the king would just take the rook. Also notice if the rook moves to f5, the king is able to run outside of the box. So remember, when you can't shrink the box, move your king closer to the opponent's king, like this. After king e5, can white shrink the box now? Notice if rook e4 check, the black king is able to move outside of the box. Remember, in a rook and king versus king position, only check the king with the rook when it is checkmate. Otherwise, bring your king closer to the opponent's king. White brings the king closer to the other king, and after king d5, can white shrink the box? You bet. Rook e4. So slowly but surely, white is making progress. After king d6, white cannot shrink the box safely, so white brings the king closer to the opponent's king. After king c6, can white shrink the box? Absolutely. Rook e5. After king d6, black decides to give white some trouble. In this position, I can't shrink the box as white, because if we play rook to d5 check, the king escapes. But also, how do I move the king closer to the opponent's king? I can't. So what do we do here? In this position, we just need to move our king somewhere to protect our rook. And in fact, there's only one square to do it. King e4. After king c6, can white shrink the box now? Absolutely. Rook to d5. And notice, white's making some real progress now. After king c7, white brings the king closer to the opponent's king. And after king c6, white continues to bring the king closer. After king c7, can white shrink the box now? Absolutely. Rook to d6. And after king to b7, white plays king to d7, getting closer to the opponent's king. After king b8, can white shrink the box? Yes, after rook c6. White's getting really close to pushing that king into the corner. After king b7, here we are again. White cannot shrink the box, but we also can't move the king closer to the opponent's king. What to do? When this happens, it's simple. Just protect your rook and make black move. Black moves to b8, and can you shrink the box now with the rook? Absolutely. Rook to c7. And after king to a8, white brings the king closer to the opponent's king. King b8. White moves the king closer again. And now, after king a8, the king is finally in the corner, and white is ready to deliver a checkmate. Can you see which rook move will deliver checkmate? If you found rook to c8, checkmate, great job. White delivers a checkmate. After learning how to checkmate with the queen and king, and now the rook and king versus king, you may expect the next videos to include checkmate with a king and one other piece. It turns out only the queen and rook can partner with the king by themselves to checkmate a lone king. All other pieces need more support to deliver a checkmate. Now that you've learned how to checkmate a king with a rook and king, it's your turn to practice the king and rook checkmate.